Cloud.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, share the screen. Is it shared?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to be talking about watering. And
Mike, you should go into presentation mode on Google Docs or whatever you're using
okay, good.
on PowerPoint.
How do I, let me see how I do that. Slideshow from the beginning.
Slideshow.
Is that good?
Yep.
All right.
There you go.
Good. We're going to do watering. And again, the thing with watering is to maintain a healthy balance and growth, and the health and growth of the tree is critical to having water as well as oxygen in the soil. You know, we never think about how much oxygen is in the soil, but if you have obviously too much oxygen, it dries out and dies. But if you don't have enough, it slowly deteriorates the roots, and infections and set in, and pests are able to mess with your trees. The other one of the first thing is when you water, don't water hard, meaning don't have your nozzle spraying the soil really hard, because it can break down the soil. And so you would not want the soil to break down. So try to water gently. I actually, in the picture that I use to promote this on the web page, it shows the person watering, and it's the nozzle's actually like a rose spray going up and down. So water gently and don't try to get it done quickly. pH is critical in water. I have well water, and years ago I was watering my trees, and it turned out it was like 8.2 or something like that. And all my trees were yellow and never really green. So it would be worth picking up some litmus paper, which is pretty cheap, and checking your water. And the optimal water pH is 6.5 to 7. 7 is neutral. 6.5 is slightly acidic. And vinegar is what I use to adjust my water to get my pH down to about 6.5, 6.6. If you're doing it by hand, you can just mix it regularly in your watering can. I have a device called dosatron, which is relatively expensive. I'm watering 100 trees, so it automatically doses the vinegar into my water to keep it at that range. So I would definitely recommend checking your pH of your water and try to make sure you're watering at the 6.5 to 7 level. If you have municipal water, chlorine's in the water and can affect your trees. And if you want to, if you leave it sit for about 24 hours, most of the chlorine will leave the water, and it makes the water a little better for your watering. If you have well water, don't think if you checked it once that it, that's what it is forever. Over the course of time, your pH can change. Typically it might get, if you have a lot of limestone or whatever, over the course of through summer and fall, sometimes the amount of water in the well is reducing, and so the concentration of lime in the water goes up. So sometimes you may need to adjust your whatever you're using to change your pH, like adding more vinegar or whatever. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe check it on a monthly basis. The other thing is some people like to use rainwater, and surprisingly, rainwater is 5.5 pH, so it's pretty acidic, which is actually pretty fascinating because things seem to look a whole lot better after it rains than after I generally water them. But there's also other minerals in that in the rainwater that's good for the trees. How often to water? And again, we're going to be talking a little bit. There are some people, if you have a work schedule, you're going to water once a day because you just have to. But if you have the option where you can be adjusting your water, you want to water the tree when the tree needs to be watered. We don't drink, we don't make sure we drink every time at the same time every day a certain amount of water. It's based on how active we are and things like that. So when you think about your trees, you want to water them so that they have this healthy balance of moisture as well as oxygen in the soil. So when you're watering trees, the things you need to be paying attention to every time you water is the foliage mass. The larger the foliage mass on your tree, the more water it should use. The smaller the foliage mass, the less water it's going to use. The second thing you want to be thinking about is the size of the reservoir, which is your container. The larger the container, the more moisture it's going to hold. The smaller the container, the less moisture it's going to hold. Third thing you want to think about is the stage of growth. For instance, when trees are just beginning to swell, they're not going to use a whole lot of water because they're just not. But as they start, after they swell and start to elongate, they can start taking a whole lot of water in because they're extending all of their leaves and needles, etc., and the amount of water that they can be absorbing can significantly increase. So as your trees are growing, they're using a whole lot more water. Sometimes after they harden off, they might seem to use less water because they're not going to desiccate as quickly because they have a cuticle. The other thing to know that certain species use more water than others. Deciduous trees tend to use a lot more water than pines. And so you may adjust your watering based on that. Other things to be thinking about when you're watering your tree is how windy it is. Wind is probably the most significant impact on the amount of moisture that is removed from your tree. I think I have a slide on this, but 80% of the water that your tree uses is for transpiration, basically to cool itself, which was shocking to me to realize that. And so when we have really windy days, the amount of evaporation that occurs increases dramatically. The other thing you want to think about is humidity. Typically, low humidity means that the tree will transpire more. If it's really, really high humidity, say 70s, 80s, your tree might not transpire. It's the same thing when it's humid for human beings. We don't sweat as much because the water just stays on our skin and doesn't evaporate and cool us. Well, plants have the same problem. The other thing to think about is how hot it's going to be in the day. The amount that if it's a low humidity, high windy, hot day, the tree's going to transpire a lot. And also how much sun exposure. The more sun exposure, the more your tree is going to transpire. Other things to think about. If you freshly repotted your tree versus have a dense root ball, freshly repotted tree, the water is going to go through pretty quickly. A dense root ball, and there'll be a lot of spaces and crevices for the water to hold. If you have a dense root ball on your tree, there is not nearly the amount of air space or even water space for the tree. And so you may have to be watering a tree with a dense root ball more frequently than one that was freshly repotted. If you have a very healthy tree and you think the roots are healthy, then you're going to be watering your tree a little bit more. I know Louise posted something today where it seems that she might have some unhealthy roots because her tree is not growing anymore. It just sort of put out what it had and it's sitting there, which suggests that the roots might not be as healthy. And therefore we're going to probably water a tree like that less. So it allows a little more air into the root mass. Time of year also needs to be, you need to be thinking about how basically in the late fall, the day length is shortening. Therefore, the tree will not dry out as quickly. At this time of the year, we have incredibly long hot days, and the tree may dry out a whole lot more quickly than it would otherwise. The next thing you want to be thinking about, and at least I always think about, when is the next time I'm going to water my tree? So if you're someone who has to water your tree once a day based on your work schedule, then that's what you have to do. But if you think your tree can make it to the next check, then obviously you wouldn't want to water the tree because it's going to allow it to have more oxygen in the soil, which ultimately is healthy for the tree. The other thing that I tend to do is also pay attention to my day-to-day experiences with the tree. I have some trees that get watered every other day just because that's how they work. I have trees that get watered twice a day because they're on the reservoir that they're in, they're on a slab, a concave slab, which doesn't hold much water. So those trees tend to get watered twice a day and need it. Sometimes the other thing that's been helpful is deciduous trees, when they are running out of water, the nice thing is they start to droop. And that is a nice sign for you. It's like, okay, the trees definitely needs water. Disappointingly, conifers like pines and spruces are less likely to do that. However, when they are in candle form, I have also seen them droop when I've pushed the limit a little bit on not watering them as frequently. So that can give you a general idea. You know, obviously you've gone too far. Remember, each tree's different. Don't get into habit, well, this one needs it today, and so this one does. This one also needs it. I always go by and check. I touch the soil, and I'm also just looking, at the soil, so I get a general idea of when does the surface start to look dry and when's the tree dry. And I touch it. Sometimes I press in a little bit below the surface of the soil because I tend to use akadama. And if the akadama is looking a light tan and dried out, even down in, then that's a suggestion to me it's time to water again. Some people use automatic watering systems, and there's the mist system versus the drip system. Overall, a misting system is probably better because a misting system, if you put it in on top of the pot, maybe more than one, it's going to cover the entire pot. The problem with the drip system is that water doesn't expand or doesn't move sideways. It just goes straight down. So if you're going to use a drip system, you have to be very careful that you're not just getting one area of the pot wet and the other part dry, where a mist system can tend to get the whole thing. Hot versus cold water. One of the things is if you leave your hose out in the sun and you decide to water it in mid-afternoon, really, really hot water is not good for the tree. So make sure you run the water out until it gets cool. If you happen to use really cold water, that's probably much less of a problem, but definitely hot water that's been sitting in the hose, and I don't know how hot it can get, but that is not good for the roots. And the idea, again, while you're watering it, is to cool the tree, and putting hot water into a hot pot, especially on a hot day, isn't going to help cool the tree down. Shallow versus deep container. One of the things to remember, you would think that a deeper container, which it does hold more water, but sometimes dries out faster than a shallow container, and that has to do with the gravity column. The gravity column on a deep container allows more water to flow out, and percentage of the water in the pot is much less, but a very shallow container will percentage-wise hold more water because it perches at the bottom. It's sort of like if you hold a sponge and fill it with water, the top will be dry, but the whole bottom stays wet. Well, with a shallow pot, a higher percentage of water stays in that. So you have to be a little more careful with your watering, as sometimes they can stay too wet. Some things to do is move trees that dry out to shade if you can only water them once a day. So make sure either there can be full shade, or maybe they might just get sun until the afternoon. If you're going to go away and you have no options, it might be best to actually bring it inside for a few days, because it's not going to transpire very much if it's inside in air condition. Now, obviously, you'd have to be careful bringing it back out, start moving it into the shade slowly or whatever. But if you're desperate and can't get anyone to water them, that's not a bad idea. Optimal temperatures for your tree to grow tend to be in around the 80s, which we had the other day. Although at the same time, when they get that hot, Doug and I were talking, he thinks that one of his trees that's sensitive got some sunburn on the leaves, but generally those are optimal temperatures. If you have your friend watering your trees, if you're trying to teach them what to do, obviously if a tree dries out, it's dead pretty quickly. Doesn't take long for a tree to dry out. So if you're going to be training them, it would probably be best that they water a little bit too much than a little bit too less. And even if you're gone for a few days or a week, that's not likely to have a serious impact on your tree. Now, if you do that throughout the, week after week, month after month, you can get an unhealthy tree. Some of the other things to do, again, if you're a little concerned, would be to move some of your trees and put them in a little more shade, so that you don't have to worry about the person watering it. Like I said, we talked about bringing it inside. Summer dormancy. This is one that got me. This can occur very quickly. One of my favorite trees is my crabapple, and it was really hot and humid, and I think it was in August. And a lot of my trees were still transpiring a lot, and I would just go along watering them. And as I've said, you should check your soil, look at it, touch it. I was just watering my crabapple tree like all the other ones. And oh, I don't know when it was, but it was probably late August, early September. All the leaves turned yellow and dropped because it was watered much too much. Ultimately, the tree came back, but remember that when it gets humid in the summer, even though it's very hot, your tree may not be using a whole lot of water at all. The other things to be thinking about right now, a lot of us are partially defoliating our trees. And one of the things I said is when you're watering your trees, pay attention to the foliage mass on top of your tree. If you partially defoliate a tree and you've removed 70% of the leaf mass or whatever, that tree is not going to use nearly as much water as it once did. So your watering needs may significantly change after the partial defoliation. Also, that tree, typically when we partially defoliate, if they're sensitive, we tend to put them in the shade, which also means they're going to use less water. Usually if we water too much, you tend to see across the canopy of the tree tend to be yellowing and you tend to get fungus. And again, that's from the roots being too wet. Drooping leaves and browning tips, that tends to be too dry. I have a couple of my trees that they started to droop and drooped a little bit more than they should have. And when I finally got them back together, some of the tips of the leaves had turned brown and died off. So that gives you a clue as to whether you're doing things too little or too much. Okay, so now I'm gonna, how do I unshare this thing? Okay, I gotta get out of this unshares. Escape. Nope. You're sharing, stop share. Okay, cool. So that's the slideshow, and I did it in 20 minutes.
Perfect.
So anyways, Doug is gonna be monitoring the chat. And so if you guys have questions, then Doug will read them and I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay. As has been the case in the last 3 meetings that I moderated, I was the first one with a question. But you mentioned chlorine in municipal water. What ill effects does the chlorine have on the trees?
I don't know that it has a significant amount of effect. You know, some people think that there's certain bacteria and fungus in the soil that is healthy for trees, and some people think the chlorine may negatively impact it. I don't think it's serious, but I guess if you're trying to be a little more particular, leaving just the water sit out in a bucket for a day should off-gas the chlorine and would be fine.
And what do you think about the idea of using a different size pot in order to adjust the tree to your available watering schedule?
I think that's a great idea. One of the things that I've downsized a lot of my pots for the aesthetic to make them look bigger and better. And the downside of that is I've got to water them a whole lot more. So I do think when you're thinking about watering or the pot sizes you're choosing, think about your ability to be able to water the tree either on demand or whether you got to do it once a day come, you know, hell or high water. So yes, I think adjusting the pot size for that would be a wise idea.
Okay. Carol asked or said that she saw something about putting a chopstick in the soil and when it dries, it's time to water. Is that something that you have thoughts on?
I have thoughts on it. There are people that swear by it and it works for them. I tried it. I didn't find that I could rely on it. I found it just unreliable or whatever. So I gave up on it. So that was my thought.
I use that for my trees. So Carol, if you want to talk to me about it afterwards, we can.
Okay.
She also asked, how deep do you go when you're touching the soil to see how it feels?
I probably don't go much more than a half an inch or whatever. And again, I happen now that I'm retired, I'm around my trees more. So I sort of have a better idea, like they can go dry or whatever. It takes time to figure out how dry your tree can get. And if you're not sort of doing it on a regular basis, it's tough to figure that out.
Yeah,
it's hard to have somebody water it for you, you know, that's not familiar with the trees, you know.
Yeah. Cindy commented about when I think you said when in regards to going on vacation, Cindy, that you put your smaller stuff either in the ground in its pot or in a bigger pot with wetter soil?
I put it in its little pot into the soil in its pot, and I leave it like that
Right.
all summer. I have to take them up and root prune them every so often, but some of my stuff's really little, and I have to.
Oh,
Yeah.
And
okay.
she
That's
puts,
interesting.
and she puts little pots into a bigger pot.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
both ways, into the ground and also into a bigger pot. I do that myself with some littler plants.
Yeah. Mine are really
Interesting,
tiny, the
interesting.
ones that I do that with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she has smaller ones
You
than me.
have to. Yeah.
Yeah. So Carol asked if she underwatered a tree and had some dead leaves, do I just let them go and hope the branch is still okay?
Yeah, initially, yeah, I would just let them go and see what happens. Because occasionally, if it sometimes you just lost part of your leaf, sometimes you lose the whole leaf, sometimes you lose the whole branch. You just won't know. But there's no benefit to cutting it or trimming it in case there is actually something live
Until
on
you
it
know, yeah.
that can come back. And it's hard to be patient. I guess if you really wanted to know, you could take your thumbnail and scratch a little bit. If you see a little green, that's good. But just be patient and wait.
Yep.
Yeah.
So next one, Cindy commented when you were talking about fungus that she had more fungus problems because it's been so wet, and
An
insect problems.
problem. Oh, insects are crazy this year.
Yeah.
In my yard, anyhow.
Yeah, the other thing I forgot to talk about was tilting the pot. One of the things that I do, if you can drill a hole in the bottom of your pot near the side wall, with a masonry bit or a ceramic bit or a tile bit or whatever, and you're getting a lot of water, if you tilt your pot, you're changing the height of the gravity column, because you're now if you will, you're turning your sponge to the side, more water's coming out. So if you do get too wet, that's a good strategy. If you don't drill a hole in your pot, then what I do is I'll tilt it for maybe 10 minutes. So water will accumulate on that side, and then I'll take it the other way and tilt it. And hopefully some of the water will fall out of the holes as it's working its way back to the end. So there's less water perching in the bottom of the pot once you do get an unhealthy system and you think that your roots are a little too wet and you're getting either a fungus or whatever. So and just don't do that for like a couple days. You're going to do that for a while, could be weeks or months, to get that to get your roots healthy again. Excuse me.
Next, Aaron had a question about watering while overwintering. How often and how much, and other thoughts about watering during the winter.
That's an excellent question. I think it depends on where your trees are. If they're outside and they're in a poly house or whatever, I don't have experience with that, but they will need to be watered. And one of the things that happens if the temperatures near the ground are 40 degrees or higher in the winter, roots will metabolize and will use a certain amount of moisture in the soil. The problem is there's no sun and wind basically to desiccate the top, so it'll look like they're wet, but actually inside they may be slowly drying out. So again, if you're in a poly house or whatever, you're going to have to water them. It would probably be worth talking to people who have poly houses. I know Bob Dietz has one, Bob Grealish has a poly house or whatever, and they've had years of experience using them to get an idea about how often they water them. If they're outside in the ground and they're getting rained on and snowed, things like that, probably minimal, if any, especially if they're frozen, because they're not going to be able to, absorb water. So if they're outside with weather impacting them and snows on them or whatever, probably minimal.
I never have to even look at mine once I put them in the ground for the winter. Like, they're done. Mother Nature takes care of them.
Right, and
Hey,
usually
Aaron.
they're healed in too.
Yeah.
Aaron, since we're discussing your question, feel free to unmute and make it a discussion. You don't have to type in the
Okay,
chat.
yeah, I have two small children beside me, so if you hear kids screaming, it's me. Yeah, I moved right as we were heading into winter, and so I was kind of scrambling, and the trees were not my first priority. Which
Really?
Yeah. So Yeah, so I had an unheated garage. It's attached though, where I kept all my sensitive and deciduous stuff. And I tried to go down there and water as much as I could and really tried to monitor them, but I think a lot of them dried out and I lost a lot of trees in the move. My pines, I kept everything that wasn't sensitive, a pine, larch, whatever, anything that was outside seemed to be fine. But I have also got just a ton of, I like live in a wind tunnel now. So that I am concerned to kind of keep them outside. I think I might have an option, but
You mean next year?
yeah, this upcoming winter.
Well, there's a couple of things I think about there's a number of things when you put trees in space, in an enclosed space, you've got problems with air circulation as well, which is really not good for trees either. So trees sometimes can die, even deciduous trees, if there's not enough air circulation moving around the trees and there's dead air space, that's not good for trees. If I put, and I don't know if this is true, people say that somehow if you sit them on concrete on the dry, it sucks the water. I'm not sure that's true, but some people put a layer of plastic on it. And I would go out and water those, periodically, maybe every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how cold. If it's frozen, the rock solid, obviously you don't need to go out there. But if they're not frozen for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe you're going to go out there and water them.
Okay.
The other thing, if you did keep them outside, if you could create a windbreak for them, because when I do keep trees outside, I tend to put chicken wire around to keep the animals, as well as plastic, just to keep the harsh winds off of the trees. Because even deciduous trees, if they're finely ramified and you have really thin branches, even though they have no foliage on them, wind in the middle of winter can desiccate those and kill them.
That was my main concern. I mean, I've got a lot more structure and opportunity to build. What I'm thinking is a big windbreak, essentially a polytunnel without a top.
Right.
And I've got a space to do that. But I do have a few trees, I've got some azaleas that I don't think can be out there.
Right.
And I'm not sure what to do with them because the garage is clearly not an option.
You know what, Aaron? I probably have 50 to 60 azaleas. Louise will vouch for me. Big ones, little ones. They all grow outside. I put them in the ground. I don't look at them till spring.
Okay.
Just so you know, I mean, I'm just saying, I have a lot of azaleas. So
I'm trying to learn
yeah.
that plant right now more than any other. And I saw your post the other day and I was eager to talk to you about how the hell you did that.
I've had them for a long time too, and I've had very good luck with them. I mean, I'm really good with them. I don't know why.
I've bought
Right.
low level ones and I haven't
Let's
had
move
good
on
luck.
to a comment from PK before we
Oh yeah.
start talking about azaleas.
Okay.
He was responding to Carol's question about chopsticks for measuring the moisture in the soil and said that using a sharpened hardwood dowel instead of chopsticks might be better because they absorb water better than the bamboo used in many chopsticks. And when I do that, I use the same type of wood. I don't actually use bamboo when I do it.
Hey, Doug, and could you indicate then when you pull that stick out, what are you making your judgment on?
Basically, I feel it. And if it feels on the dry side of moist, then it's probably time to water. And really, it's been helpful for me in judging trees that I put into much shallower pots this year to make sure that I'm not watering them when they're too wet. And so often I'll pull it out and I think the top looks dry, but down, the 1/4 inch in the soil, it's still very wet. So you pull it out and feel it if it feels wet or dry, and you'll get a feel for how wet or how dry is appropriate for your tree if you're paying attention to how it looks every time you water it. I had a couple things that I'd like to add as observations. I'm kind of a data geek, so I've been tracking a lot of data about the trees that I have. And one thing that I've noticed is water is also a thermal insulator for the roots. So especially in these last few days when it was hot out, I've been measuring the temperature of the leaves and the trunk and the soil of a number of my trees, and the soil was routinely 5 to 10 degrees cooler than the trunk or the leaves. And that amount of cooling went down to less than 5 degrees when the tree was on the verge of needing to be watered. So on hot days, it can actually provide a lot of protection, even if your tree is in a very dark pot that's absorbing a lot of energy from the sun. The water in the pot can protect the roots from getting too hot. And then another aspect of that is to consider whether your soil is shaded by your tree or something else, or whether the soil is exposed directly to the sun. You can lose a lot of water to evaporation directly out of the soil without it actually going through the tree. So that's a consideration that seems to have been important. And then also whether your tree has top dressing or not. So the top dressing can help keep the soil in there and prevent that evaporation from the sun, and equalize the water levels between the top and the bottom of the pot. I don't know if you agree with those observations, Mike, or if you have comments along those lines or not.
No, I completely agree with them. I want to add one or two things which Doug said. When it gets really, really hot, you can take a couple things. Some people will actually take aluminum foil and wrap their pots to reflect the heat. Some people will stick a board on the southern exposure of their pot, you know, a 2x4 or whatever, lean up against it so it stops the sun from baking the pot. Because again, if you're thinking that the tree uses its water to cool, if that pot, if it's, I don't know, gets in the 90s and the sun's baking it or whatever, maybe not a bad idea to shade the pot, which will keep the water inside the pot cooler, which allows, because if that water in the pot gets really, really hot, then the tree isn't getting cooled when it, you know, when it goes up. So just adding on to what Doug said, those were good comments.
I would say though that the temperature of the water in the pot doesn't actually cool the trunk or the leaves. By the time the water has been brought through the roots and through the wood of the tree out to the foliage, it has achieved the temperature that the tree is at.
Right.
It's the actual evaporation out of the leaves that actually provides the cooling. Okay, couple more questions. Think this is Jim, is that right? JGSDVMOSU, I keep forgetting who that is. Says, I have a bald cypress that I seem to have lost the upper part this winter. There are lower live branches and just looking for options on what to do to prevent this in the future. Yeah, this is Jim.
You know, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know. Terry Monroe told me the same thing. That he had part of his tree die as well. And I don't know. Again, it's a possibility that maybe it did dry out a little bit since the top died. That's, you know, that's the furthest away or from getting water. That would be a possibility. Maybe the other thing, we had a really cold winter. Like we had some, I don't know, pretty low temperatures, much below freezing. And, you know, sometimes the roots can get damaged for that. So I don't have any good answers. Anybody else got a suspicion?
Nope.
Not me.
Okay, that's the end of the written questions. I think at this point we could open it up to anybody who has comments or other questions they want to do without having to type them.
You know, Mike, I wanted to comment that I did remember you saying something about the foliage, and because I had this one tree, it put out all this foliage, it was drying out every day. I cut it way back and it's not drying out anymore. I mean, I don't know if that's a good thing to do. I mean, it needed to be cut back, but still.
Right. But it is. It's just important to know that,
yeah.
you know, because it's easy to get into a habit. I just water it every day. I water it every day, and then you do this partial defoliation, and now
Right.
it's not moving the water. Like I said, within a day, when you get summer dormancy, you can get really humid. And your tree can be using water, and the next day it's not using it, and
Right.
it I mean it can drop dramatically. So always pay attention. And the reason I say this is because I don't always pay attention, but I should always pay attention.
Yeah.
I've screwed it up enough that it's like, no, you need to pay attention. I'm just
Yeah, I'll
curious.
share one. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I just was curious, how many people here water once a day because they just gotta water once a day? That's like at minimum, like, or not minimum, it's like their life is such, they can't go
I
out.
have to. I have no choice. My stuff's all root bound. I
Okay.
mean, it's in little pots and stuff. I
Water
do
once
water
a
once
day.
Yeah. Yep.
I water once a day, even though I probably could water twice. It depends on the temperature. If
Yeah.
it is really hot, I'll water in the evening and then I'll water mid-morning.
Yeah, I've done that too on certain things.
What I tend to do, and I listen to Bjorn, I go out, again, I'm retired. So I go out around 10 o'clock and water and then check around 4. So if I
Yeah.
water at 10, and I have stuff in the morning, I'll say to myself, if it can make it to 4 o'clock, then I'm not watering it. And then I'll water it at 4 or whatever. So my trees are definitely watered. Well, some of them get watered almost once a day, but I'm watering them a whole lot less at different times than that, which I think has helped my trees stay a little healthier than they used to be.
That's
So
why, yeah.
I'll add a comment that last year I was actually measuring the water usage of my trees about every 3 hours. And I noticed, that some of them, based on the size of the tree and the size of the pot, would use, it would go like 27 hours between waterings, which meant I was watering that tree at a different time every day. And the interesting thing was, of course, on one day you'll water it at, say, 7 p.m., which means the next day you're not going to have to water it at all because it will be able to survive the whole night and the whole next day. And then you'll water it on the morning of the day after that, because during the night, the amount of water usage really slowed down to almost nothing.
Oh, yeah.
They were still using water during the night, but very, very little. So, that's just another consideration. And that varied depending on the amount of clouds, the amount of sun, the amount of humidity, and all that sort of stuff, not just whether it rained or not. And so the amount of variability due to various conditions was really interesting to observe. But under constant conditions, the rate of water usage was pretty much the same, except during that early spring time of the year when the new foliage is being pushed out. So water usage was really high then. And I noticed that some trees actually could grow out of overgrow the pot so that they would need to be watered way too frequently. But if I defoliated them a little bit and brought the amount of foliage back to something that was appropriate for the size of the pot,
Right.
then
Exactly.
they could exist for a day or 2 days when they were watered.
You
So it's
sort of said
definitely,
what I was going to say, Doug. That's what I
Yeah.
was trying to say. Yeah.
You're getting close to your 45 minutes.
Oh, we have to remind him.
Yeah, automatic cutoff.
I know. It just turns off.
Well, actually,
Oh, does it? Yeah.
I'm paying for the Zoom thing, so it's not going to cut off.
Yeah, okay.
Oh,
All right.
If there's a few more questions or comments, we'd be happy to take them.
Okay, so with my tree, I'm tilting it right now until I can get up the nerve to lift it out of its pot to look at the roots.
Well, I
Oh,
wouldn't
that-
look at
that
those
try that.
roots. I
Yeah.
wouldn't lift it out. I would just keep it a little drier through the entire year. This isn't going to fix in a week or a couple weeks. I would just keep it a little bit on the dry side. Typically what I just did, I just repotted my crabapple. It put out its new growth and it's just sitting there. And it's not growing anymore. So basically I'm assuming the roots just have enough to sustain what it's got, and it's not going to give, until the roots are healthier, it's not going to put on any more foliage. And so when the roots aren't that healthy, then they need a little more oxygen than water, and they don't need a whole lot of fertilizer either.
And
hey,
the
Carol.
tree just like it stopped at spring
Right. That's what mine did. It came out and just stopped. It hasn't
And
done
spring,
anything.
the leaves.
Yep.
There are some turning green though, from
Right.
one end of the tree.
Right.
Well, Louise, you had that happen with those air layered, what do you call them? Flowering quinces that we had. They almost looked like they were going into fall, but then they ended up being okay. Yours, weren't they?
Yeah, it was last year that happened.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't,
So I had a question for Carol.
Yeah,
Carol, if I understand right, you just have 2 trees. Is this your first year doing bonsai?
it is. Yeah. And I had planned on going to the how we talked afterwards. I'd planned on going to the nursery after and just starting to pick up a bunch of stuff and just kind of see what happens with
we
it.
got a
So-
show coming up. You
Yeah,
can buy
wait
it
till
at
you
the
see what
show.
we
Yeah.
have to sell.
What's that?
Wait till you see
We
what
got-
we have to sell.
I
At
know.
the show, yeah. We
Yeah.
only got a week.
I
Yeah.
feel like if I haven't got them at a workshop and they're dug from like Bob Grealish's, then I don't want them. So
My
Okay.
question is regarding watering. What are your observations as somebody really new about watering? What, is
that I'm
it
not
something?
doing it correctly. Actually, I had a question about what about like watering them by putting them into a container and letting them absorb from the bottom up.
There's pros and cons to that. The pro is you're guaranteed that you're talking about like sinking it in the water.
Yes,
Yeah, the
I
pro
tried
is
that.
you're guaranteed it's 100% wet every time you do it. The con might be you're constantly sort of adjusting in if there's bacteria and fungus in the soil, you're sort of screwing around a little bit with that. But I don't know that it's critical.
Okay.
You could
Okay.
do that.
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, I do it once a day just because that's what my schedule allows, but I really do need to figure out like, figuring out to my own understanding what is good for the soil by touch or by using a dowel or
Carol,
something.
when you
So
get 200 trees, that'll take up too much of your time. You're gonna have to just water them with the hose.
there you go.
Are you available to check them more than once a day, or you only like you have to do them in the morning because you go to work?
Yeah, I go to work. Yeah. But actually I'm off for the summer, so it'll be a little bit different now. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, like for instance, today I watered my trees yesterday morning, and a lot of them would have got, but it lightly rained last night where I am.
Yeah.
I didn't water any of my trees, not because I thought they were full of water. It was overcast and cool all day long. So and even though I know they weren't completely watered, I knew they would make it, and I checked them. So for instance, none of my trees got watered today, partly because it was just so cool and overcast. I knew they weren't going to be using a lot of water. So
we had heavy rain
Oh, we
here.
had
so-
heavy rain
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, really heavy rain.
So Carol, when you say you submerge them all the way so
I
that
only
they're
did it.
flooded?
Yeah. No,
and
I
then you
only
pick
did
them
it
back up?
once. I just tried it once to see how it would work. I did that, I think, maybe Monday or maybe Tuesday. And yes, I just put it, no, I didn't completely submerge it. I just put it sort of in up until probably a quarter of the bottom. So, but it didn't
so
end up absorbing all the water.
Well, when we
I would-
repot, we
uh,
submerge them.
Sorry, Cindy.
Oh, yeah.
Go
Go ahead.
Carol, I would highly recommend not doing it that way.
Yeah.
Let it absorb from the bottom, because
Yeah.
what you can easily get in a situation like that is a really high accumulation of salts and minerals and other dissolved solids in your water source
Yeah.
accumulating in the soil. When you water from the top, that gets continually flushed out with new fresh water.
Okay.
If you're going to do that, you would want to submerge it all the way. And then when you take it back out, all of that liquid can then drain out, and it'll be a kind of a flush. But if you let it absorb from the bottom up, you will never flush your soil.
I won't continue to do that.
That's
So.
true. That's true.
Okay. That was a good point. I didn't know that, Don.
Yeah, true. That makes sense.
Okay. Any other suggestions or going forward, are there any topics that anybody who came would like to, see on a future Zoom discussion?
Fungus.
Anthony, did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I actually have one more question about the watering. So this past year, I recently switched a lot of my plants to an inorganic substrate, which Akadama, lava rock, and pumice. And I go to work, I water them in the morning, go to work during the day, but a lot of them, by the time I get home, it's all so dried out. So is the best thing to mix some organic matter into there, or what would you recommend for that?
Well, do they make it through the day? In other words, even if they're dry, are they drooping? In other words, if they're making it and they're healthy, then I think you're good. Now,
Okay.
if
True, yeah.
and so you could add more organic into your mix, which would help, which should make it last longer because you're reducing the amount of air space and you're gonna more moisture is gonna stay in that. But if you're making it home and they're healthy and doing well, then I don't know that I would change it. That's my point. In other words, I guess I should have started this by saying, if whatever you're doing is working really well, don't listen to anything I told you. just keep doing what you're doing.
Anthony, the other thing you can do if you're worried about, if you think you're on the border between something that's working and something that's not, is a top dressing is a good way to make sure that water doesn't evaporate, and then it should last longer. If you put on sphagnum moss or sphagnum moss along with another kind of moss that grows, those do a really good job of keeping the water in the soil until the tree uses it instead of just having it evaporate.
Okay, thank you guys very much.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I
Seems
have a
like that's
question-
it.
I have a question about the show, which is
Sure.
not related to this. Should I just email or something?
well,
Let's,
ask it.
let-
Go ahead.
We could stop the recording and then we can go on and talk about whatever.
Okay, I'll stop the recording. Stop. Are you sure you want to stop recording? Yes.